Hi, my name is Jonathan Culp. I'm the plugin creator, and I'm here to talk about some of the features and run you through getting it set up in Unity. Before we get started doing that, I wanted to talk a bit about why I wrote the plugin in the first place. So the last game I worked on was an Apple Arcade title, and our studio used CloudKit for the save files, and at the time we did what most busy developers do, and we just grabbed an asset from the asset store, and we evaluated a few options, and we found that they worked okay for doing some basic things, but they were missing a lot of features. For instance, you couldn't do batch requests or atomic operations, both of which are really important for maintaining data integrity between records. You also had no access to record metadata, things like the last modified time or the server change token, and those are important for keeping files in sync. And they only gave you access to a small portion of the native Objective-C API. We found it really difficult to create a robust cloud save system using the assets that were out there. So I told myself that if I found some free time, I could do better. So after we shipped, lo and behold, I had some free time. So this plugin is a result of that. And so the goal for this plugin was to give you complete access to the native Objective-C framework, so that anything you could have written natively, you can now do in C#. So this means that this is a great plugin for anyone who needs access to CloudKit's more advanced features, things like custom containers or shares or push notifications. So I'm going to walk us through setting up a project from scratch and demo some really basic features. First, let's make a new project. We're just going to call this example. And we'll give that a second to boot up. This plugin, it'll work for all the Apple build targets. It'll work on Mac OS, tvOS, and iOS. It's just one plugin for all three. Today we're going to demo a Mac OS project, which is good for two reasons. One is that I can actually record the screen without flipping into a different device. The other is that when you make a Mac OS project, you have to set up the provisioning profiles, the certificates, and the identifiers in the developer portal manually. If we were making an iOS build, Xcode would do a lot of that for us automatically. And it's good just to know how to do this by hand in case something goes wrong. Signing for Apple is a pretty error-prone process, and it's good to know how to do things manually. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is import the plugin. We're going to use the package manager for that. You'll have installed the plugin through the asset store, so the steps here might be a little bit different than what I'm about to show, but I've got the plugin natively on disk. I'm just going to point it to the package.json file. Hit open. So in the package manager, we'll have links for the changelog, the licenses, the documentation. Recommend you check those out. They'll have links to the website, which contains some support forums and some different ways to get you started, some tutorials and stuff like that. Additionally, the plugin comes with about 8 project samples that you can import into your project. They'll demonstrate some of the more advanced uses of CloudKit. Definitely recommend checking those out to get a feel for how to use the API. But for this demo, we're just going to code something from scratch and just get you into the plugin as quickly as possible and make sure that you have it set up properly. So I'm not going to import those right now. There are a few required settings. So we're going to go to project settings. One thing you want to make sure is that you have a good bundle identifier set up. So I'm going to set the company name here, and then the bundle identifier, they're just going to use these fields to automatically generate one for us. That's why it's a good idea to pick a good product name from the start, because then you don't have to change this at a later date. So Just down here, that make sure the bundle identifier is the thing that we want it to be. This plugin is going to work with either scripting backend, Mono or IL2CPP. You can leave those as they are. The other settings you're going to want to make sure that you have checked are, one is going to be your team signing ID. Now, you're going to get this out of the Apple developer portal. Just click on your account. Let's see. If we head over to the certificates, identifiers, and profiles, you'll see that next to your name, that's going to be your team ID. You're going to want to make sure to copy that into Unity. This is used during the signing process, so it needs to be there, especially for a Mac OS build. So make sure that this is filled out in the iOS settings. The Mac build target is going to use it, but it's going to be grabbing it from here. All right, anything else? Oh yeah, the last thing is here is that the target minimum iOS version, this needs to be set to, at a minimum, 11. I don't think CloudKit was introduced into iOS before version 11 here. We'll just save that. And that's it for project settings. Additionally, the plugin is going to install some build settings in the Assets Plugins HovelHouse CloudKit resources folder. And this is a scriptable object that is used to run some signing scripts or copy some project settings over into Xcode properly. The default values should all work for you from the get-go, but if you need to do anything custom, you can do that here. So the next thing we want to do is make sure that we have our app's certificates, identifiers, and provisioning profiles set up. If you're used to doing this on iOS, Xcode handles a lot of this for you, but we're going to do it manually. The reason that we're doing it manually is because currently Unity doesn't have any support for creating macOS applications that'll generate a good Xcode project. They added sort of experimental support for this in 2019.3, but as of right now, it's still not working very well. And if we were to make an Xcode project for a macOS target, we'd have to go in and we'd have to muck with the settings a lot. So we're just going to make a standard build, which is going to use the plugins build scripts. So the next thing we want to do is set up our app for app signing, which means creating a certificate, some application identifiers, and the provisioning profile. Now, if you've made an iOS app before, you're probably already familiar with this process, so feel free to skip ahead in the video a bit. But even if you have done this before, it may be worth watching this one more time because we're going to do it manually from the Apple developer portal. Normally, Xcode would generate a lot of these things for you automatically, but because in Unity there's no Xcode project support for Mac OS yet, we're going to have to do this by hand, so it can be good to have a refresher. So we're going to hop on over to the developer portal. The first thing we're going to do is going to make a certificate. If you've been developing other apps, you probably already have one, but we're just going to do this from scratch just for completeness sake. So we're going to demo a Mac development build. If you were putting this up on the App Store, you'd want one of these other builds, either the distribution or the installer distribution profile. So hit continue. Apple's going to need a certificate signing request from your computer to help cryptographically verify your identity as a developer. So the way you give them this is you go into Keychain Access, go up here to the Certificate Assistant, and click on Request the certificate from a certificate authority. But just put in your email address, your name or your studio's name, and then the request is saved to disk. So hit continue. That's going to be placed on the desktop. Back on the portal, just click choose file, point to the signing request we just made, and upload that. All right, so now we've got a developer certificate, so download that, click on it, and it's going to import it into Keychain Access. Right. Okay. So a certificate is something you can use on multiple projects. It's not specific to any one project, but the identifier is going to uniquely identify your application. To get CloudKit to work, we're going to create two, one for the app itself, and then another identifier for something called the CloudKit container. And containers are sort of like an app sandbox. It's like a weird Apple version of an application sandbox. You don't really need to know a ton about them, just that they're required. So let's go and create an identifier for our app. I'm going to select app ID. Description, it's like plugin installation example. And for the bundle ID, copy the bundle ID from Unity. And I definitely recommend copying and pasting. Small typos can really make this whole process a complete nightmare. For instance, if we accidentally made this like a capital E, that could break a lot of things once it comes to signing and configuration. And the error messages we would get as a result of that are not very intuitive, so definitely I recommend copying and pasting. So an identifier also identifies the capabilities that your app is going to use once it's installed on the device. So the only ones we need for demonstration purposes are going to be the CloudKit ones. Additionally, you may also want to enable push notifications. Some CloudKit features require them. Some of the more advanced features require them. For instance, sharing records between users uses the push notification system. So if you're using any of that stuff, make sure that this is clicked. If at any point you need to go back and change the capabilities that are part of your identifier, it's going to invalidate your provisioning profile, and you'll need to regenerate one of those as well. All right, so we're going to hit continue, and then register. Okay, looks like I already have one of these set up. So let's use the one that's already set up. All right, HovelHouse example. So after we make it the first time, we need to go back in and add a CloudKit container here. So back out of here, find this little dropout over here. Instead of app ID, go down and select iCloud containers. Then we're going to hit the plus button. Make sure iCloud containers is selected, hit continue. Enter a description, an example iCloud container. And the identifier here, we're going to input what is known as the default identifier, which is the word iCloud, dot, and then just your bundle identifier. Just like this. One thing to note here is that once this iCloud container is made, there's no way to delete it. So if you're worried about junking up your Apple developer portal with a bunch of like test containers, try to make sure that you've got a good idea of what your bundle identifier is going to be before you start this process. Because once again, once you make it, you're stuck with it forever. So another thing to note here is that, again, capitalization does matter. Like, it'll let you make this identifier. But if you specify a lowercase h during setup, it's not going to be able to find it, and your app is going to give you some really weird error messages. So really make sure that everything is spelled like 100% correctly. It'll just save you a lot of headache down the road. All right. Hit continue, and now we have a new iCloud container that we can never delete. All right, done. All right, the last thing we need to do in the identifiers is go back to the identifier that we originally created, and now associate that iCloud container with the app identifier. So down here, example plugin for import. Go down to the iCloud capability, and I'll hit configure and select the container that we created in the last step. You're welcome to add multiple containers. Sometimes that's a useful thing to do, but generally speaking, you only really need the one. All right, now we hit save. And one of the reasons we set up the identifier first is that if we had gone ahead and created the provisioning profile and then added the container to it, we'd need to do it all over again. So hit save. Right, that's that message. All right. Last step, profile. So, plus button. We are creating a Mac OS app development profile. If this build was going up to the App Store, use one of these ones. But this is going to be just fine for local testing. Continue. Now we need to select the app ID we created. Example for plugin import. Continue, and then select the certificates you want to use for this. So this is the one we created in the last step. You're welcome to select them all. There's no harm in it, but only one of them is really going to be applicable. Next, you're going to select the devices that your app is allowed to run on in developer mode. In this case, it's my one and only Mac, my MacBook Pro. Select that and hit continue. Now, if you try to run an application on a device that's not in this list, the application is going to quit pretty much immediately with a signing error message. All right. We'll give this a good scripted name. Demonstration. Provision. Profile. Generate. Download that. Click it. It'll install itself to system preferences. This is an important step. Make sure you do this. And then, and hopefully we did all of that correctly. It's a very error-prone process. It's an easy process to make mistakes in. But yeah, hopefully that just worked. So we can minimize that. Finally, get back to the application and start demoing some code. All right. So now that we have all the certs and IDs set up, go to the build settings. Down here into Mac OS build settings, make sure that this is enabled. Enable post-process Mac OS. This is going to make the plugin run a signing script. This is something we need to do if we're not going to generate an Xcode project, which is the thing that usually handles signing for us. So here in code signing identity, we need the name of the identity we use to create our certificate with. So an easy way to get this is to hop back into keychain access, select the certificate we just installed, and if you're like me and you work for multiple teams, you may have like a bunch of these that are really hard to tell apart. So one way you can do that is by going down into Get Info, and just verifying that the organizational unit matches the one you're currently working on. In this case, this is not the right profile. Let's go back here. Make sure that that's the right one. Yeah, there we go. Demonstration provisioning profile. Application ID. Okay, yeah, it's the right app ID. It's the DCQF. Now your team ID, it's publicly available information. It's okay to sort of share these. So let's see. Get info on this one. Right, organizational unit, that's the correct one. Organization, myself. Okay, good. So what we're looking for is the name of the certificate, which is just select this from up here and hit copy. You can also get this out of the get info panel. It's going to be known as the common name right here. So take that value, hop back to Unity, and paste that into this field right here. The only other thing we need to point it to is the provisioning profile we made. Hop into downloads, demonstration provisioning profile, and yeah, hit open. All right. These other steps down here, if you have either custom plist entries or custom entitlement entries that you want to add to the plugin default ones, you can specify either of those files here. And once you do, it'll merge them into the final plist and the final entitlements file. All right. So now that we're done with the build settings set up, let's just create a quick little demonstration scene and just verify that our app signing is working. That's the thing that's most likely to go wrong. So we're just going to create a quick project just to verify that the setup is done correctly. I'm going to create really minimal UI here. We're going to put up a text field and we're going to reroute the debug logs to it so that we can see the logs on the screen. Otherwise, we'd have to, go crawling through the file system for those things. Let's make that black. Add our text field. Size that. Give it a bit of a margin. Increase the font size to say 28. And let's change its color to something brighter. How's that? That looks good. All right. So let's add a new script. It's called example. Open that up in Visual Studio. First things first, let's just reroute debug logs to the text field we just made. Public text, import Unity UI. And application log message received, and we'll add a new event listener for that. On log message received. Generate this method. And then whatever goes to debug log now goes to our text field. So we'll do text plus equals condition plus a new line character. And then as a really basic test, we're just going to try to print the name of the CloudKit container out. So import the HovelHouse namespace and then the CloudKit plugin. And there's no there are no prefabs you need to add to the scene. All you have to do is import the namespace and start typing. So let's do debug.log CK container. CK stands for CloudKit. And then default container. And then we're going to print out the container identifier. Now the default container, again, is just going to be your bundle identifier. with the word CloudKit prepended to it. Now, the default container is not guaranteed to exist. It's something you have to set up, but anytime you're looking for the default container, it's going to be looking for something of this form. All right. So if we either messed up our signing or messed up our certificates or identifiers, this operation isn't going to work. We're not even going to be able to read the value of our container identifier. But if everything is set up correctly, it should just output itself to the screen. So we're just going to run this real quick and check that everything is done properly. So just clear that. Let's see, am I forgetting anything else? Yeah, let's see, I need to assign the text field to the script. All right, so now we are ready to make a build. Go to build settings, make sure that create Xcode project is left off. The plugin will still work if you do create an Xcode project, but right now Xcode support for macOS is not entirely there in Unity. So you'd have to do a lot of editing of the project by hand in order to get things to work. Full instructions on how to do that will be posted on the website if you are interested. So be sure to check that out there. But for demonstration purposes, we're going to be using the plugin's post-build scripts to handle signing the application properly. So all you should need to do is hit this build button. If anything does go wrong, do pay attention to the console output. The build signing scripts will print out any errors that it encounters there. Great, so you see here that this is the iCloud identifier we were expecting. So if that did print to the screen, it means that your signing and your entitlement is set up correctly. If there was an error in your entitlements, for instance, if your app's capabilities didn't match the same one that you would use to make your provisioning profile with, one of two things would have happened. One is that the application would have crashed immediately upon the startup with a code signing error, or you would have gotten a really sort of somewhat cryptic error message instead of the name of the iCloud container. So this is a good indication that everything is working as properly. So why don't we actually get down to writing some actual code. I am sorry the setup for this is so lengthy, but that's just kind of the way Apple handles things. So let's hop back into our example. And I will show you some of the basics. All right. All right. Because one of the most basic operations in CloudKit is just obviously going to be saving records. So in order to save records, we need access to a CloudKit database. And we get this database from the container. So let's do that this way. Our database is equal to ckcontainer.defaultContainer. Private cloud database. So every container is going to have 3 different databases that you can pick from. The most popular one, I think, is going to be the private cloud database. But there's also a public cloud database and a shared cloud database. There's not a ton of difference between the 3 of them. They're all going to have the same API, and they'll have slightly different capabilities. But the really big difference between these 3 is that the private cloud database, that's going to store records in the user's iCloud quota. So what this means for you as a developer is that any data you store in your user's iCloud account, that storage you get for free. You don't have to pay for that. The downside is that, most people have pretty packed iCloud drives, so there's no guarantee that the storage you want to use is going to be there. they could be full up on space. So that's kind of a risk you take. If you need to get around that limitation, you can opt for the public cloud database. Records stored here are not going to count towards your user's iCloud usage, but storage here is not free. This is something you would have to pay Apple for as the app developer. So you'd either pay based on how much storage you would need, or the number of web requests that your app is making. So like I said, we're going to be using the private iCloud database, and we are going to get our storage for free. Right. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a new record. And the way you do that is by creating a new instance of CK record. And all records are going to have a required record type. It just identifies sort of the schema that that record is going to use. So we're going to make one called my record type. Not a very inventive name. And that's all that's required of a record, so we could save this directly, for instance. So to do that, you would type database dot save record, and then the record we just made. The second parameter here is going to be a callback function that gets fired once the request is complete. So we'll type that in on record saved. We use Visual Studio to auto-generate that. Change these poorly named arguments, record and error. So CloudKit is a transport technology, so whether or not something works is dependent on a number of things, but one of the most common ones is going to be like whether or not you've got a good internet connection, or whether or not the server is slammed. So there's always a possibility that even if you set everything up, that there's going to be an error that happens. So in all of these callbacks, just make sure that you check to see if the error exists or not before proceeding. So if there is an error, we're just going to log it out to the screen. Error dot description. So this is a version of the native error request. The native error object from Objective-C. So all the things that you may be used to saying in Objective-C are going to be accessible to you here from C#. Right. So we'll print out the failure reason if there's an error, and if there's not an error, let's print out some information about the record we just saved. Now all records are going to have a record ID. A record ID is a way to uniquely identify that record in the database. You can specify them by hand if you want to, but if you don't specify one when you create the record, CloudKit's going to make one for you once the record is saved. So let's just print out the name of that record ID to the screen. It's going to be accessible via record.recordID.recordName. All right, let's run this. Let's open up the modified application. And there we go. Saved a record with ID, big alphanumeric string. So just to verify that this is like really working, let's hop back to the Apple Developer Portal, and let's open up the CloudKit dashboard. And this is going to be a web interface into the CloudKit records that we've been saving. Go to account. All right. So on the left here in the panel on the side, hit CloudKit dashboard. dashboard's going to list all of the container IDs that you made. So if you have multiple, again, you're going to need to select the proper one. So we're going to select the example container. And then to take a preview of the records we've saved so far, go on and click Data. Right. Now you'll see that this is already auto-populated, this drop-down list of my record type. And we can hit Query Records. Nothing's going to show up when we hit this until we modify a few things. The new record type we make doesn't have any indexable fields on it, so we're not going to be able to query anything until those are set. So to do that, select the drop-down from over here. Instead of Data, go down to Schema. Over here is going to be a list of the record types you've made so far. And we're going to hit Edit Indexes. And we only have one thing we could possibly index by, which is the record name. So just make sure that's set to queryable. Hit Save Changes. And now when we run the query again, we should see the record that we created in the application show up here. Right there. So this record has no information in it, which is pretty useless. So let's head back to the code, and I'll show you how to add some data into records. So this time, instead of creating a new blank record, let's make a new record with a new record ID. So in the constructor for the record, type new CK record ID, and then a custom record name. Record name. Apple's got some restrictions on what good record names are. I'm pretty sure there are things like can't start them with a number or super strange characters, but pretty much any variable name is going to work as a record ID here. Now let's set some data on the record. So every record has a bunch of set methods that'll set fields on the record to different types of things. So the basic ones are going to be set string. First parameter is going to be the string we want to save. And the second parameter here is going to be the key, or the way you would refer to that value on the record. So we'll just call it string key. You also have ones for integers. Set int. Good integer. And we've got one for floating point values, set double. There's a good double. Those are going to be your basic ones. But there are more advanced ones, such as record.setBuffer. You can use this to store arbitrary binary data. Send it any array of bytes with the key, and it'll save that. So I guess image data, audio data, stuff like that is a pretty good fit for this. Right. Additionally, we also have a set reference. This will let you set a field that points to another record in the database. This is a good way to create parent-child relationships in the database, or one-to-many or many-to-many relationships in the database. You can also have parent records that automatically delete any of their child records once they're deleted. It's a pretty useful thing to have. Additionally, there's something called setAsset. This takes a file URL as its first parameter. So you'd use this to point to a file on your hard drive, right? Like home some file.bytes. And this is good for really big files, things that you don't necessarily want to store all that information on the database. A good example of something like this would be a video file. You know, the file already exists. You wouldn't want to like resave, hundreds of megabytes of information just to keep a record of it in the database. So this is sort of like a file pointer. and it'll upload any local file you have onto your user's iCloud storage space. But for the moment being, let's just save some basic data. All right, so let's go back to Unity. Hit build again. Okay, so see here that we saved our record with my record name, and if we go back into the dashboard, hit query again, we'll see our new custom named record with the fields we just created. Or actually, they're not showing up here, but they are showing up here in the fields column. Yep. So we have our three values: hello world, pi, and a little joke from the Hitchhiker's Guide. Right. So in CloudKit, there's no difference between saving a record and updating a record. If you want to update a record, you should fetch it from the database first and modify its values and then resave it. That gives us a good way to demonstrate how a record fetch would work. So why don't we try to update one of our existing records. Let's see. So to do that, we would do database. Let's quit this. Fetch record with ID. Its first argument is going to be a CK record ID. So new CK record ID. And we will pass in my record name. And then the second parameter is going to be a callback function. I could make a new local function, but I'm kind of big on lambdas, so we're going to try the lambda version of that this time. So this is just an anonymous function. Debug.log, fetched record, and let's take the record and let's change one of its parameters. Let's change the int to 0 instead of 42. Let's see, what was the key name was called the answer. Now that's going to modify the value of the record in memory, but it's not going to persist on the database until we resave it. So we will do a database.save record, point it back to our onRecord save callback, and run that. Now, some of you may be wondering why I'm constantly rebuilding the macOS project instead of trying to run this from editor. Although the library is built for macOS, it won't run in editor because, basically because of entitlements. Because CloudKit requires entitlements to run, the application needs to be cryptographically signed before macOS will let it execute. That's basically the reason why the plugin would never work in editor, because we'd need to be re-signing the Unity editor itself. And that would require us to have our own bundle identifier for it, and basically to have access to the Unity project itself as a developer. It's just something that can't practically be done. Which is a real shame, because it would really make testing go a lot faster. All right, so fetching the record, and then presumably the record is updated. So just to verify that that's working, back to the dashboard, query our records again, and see if the value has changed. And yep, the answer is now 0. So that's how you update a record in CloudKit. And for tidiness sake, let's go over deleting records. So what I've been using currently is known as the Convenience API. But in addition to the Convenience API, CloudKit also has more complicated but also more powerful operations that you can use. So the Convenience API version of delete looks like this. Database.delete record with ID. And again, we'd make a new CK record ID, my record name, and that would delete the record that we've been playing around with. But one of the things you'll notice about the Convenience API is that it only lets you work on one record at a time. The actual CloudKit operations are a little bit more flexible. So I'm going to demonstrate that with what's known as the modify records operation. Now the CK modify records operation is kind of a strange beast. It takes two parameters. First is a list of records to save. Sorry, not a list, an array of records to save. And the second is a list of records to delete. This lets you save and delete multiple records at the same time. I'm really not sure why this is not two distinct operations. It seems a little bit confused as an API method. But I'm going to use this as an example of deleting both of the records we created during this demonstration at the same time. Since we're not saving records with this operation, the first parameter can be null. It could also be an empty array. And then this second array is going to be both CK records. Sorry, CK record IDs. So I'm just going to copy this identifier out of, oh, is that not selectable? Okay, that's a pain. Yeah, there's a bug in the dashboard sometimes that that these fields are sometimes not selectable. So I don't really feel like typing that out by hand, so we're just going to delete one of the records instead of both. Now, one of the strange things about the operations, if you're not using the Convenience API, is that in order to get them to run in a timely manner, you have to reach into the configuration property and set a custom quality of service on them. This is an enum that contains different priorities for the operation. And the default one takes anywhere from immediately to 5 minutes to run. You want to pick something that's either user initiated or user interactive, and that's going to make sure that it doesn't sit around for a while. All right. And so the way you kick off a request like this is that you would type database.add operation and the operation itself. Additionally, each operation has one or more callback functions that let you know how the operation is proceeding. So the big ones are going to be the completion blocks. Block is sort of Objective-C's version of basically a Lambda function. And we will just create a new callback method for this. On records modified. But operations also have these other callbacks that'll be called per record, or if a record is really big, say it's like hundreds of megabytes, you can also get it per record progress or get updates as it's uploading. These are good things to use for more complicated use cases. So we'll let Visual Studio auto-generate this callback. And so this first parameter here is the records that were saved. Second parameter here is the IDs of records deleted. Not the records themselves, because, well, they were deleted. Third one's the error. So, again, if the error is not null, print out the error information to the screen. And if there were no errors, then it's safe to access the record saved or the deleted record IDs. If there was an error, both of these parameters would come through as null, so we always want to check for the error, otherwise attempting to access them would throw a null reference exception. Do it along. Just using a little link syntax here to take this array of record IDs and turn it into an array of record names. And just for good measure, we will also print out, let's see, how many records we saved. Saved records. Sorry, not count length, it's an array. Okay, build once more. Wait a little bit. Oh, I guess I was wrong about that. Record name cannot be empty. Okay, so let's change it up. So here where I had null, that is not allowed. New CK record. Just make that an empty array. Okay, let's try it one more time. What am I doing wrong here? Oh, right, that. This can be null. This is not allowed to be an empty string. Actually, let's just see if I can type this out by hand. I'd actually really like to demo deleting two records at the same time. Oh, great, unavailable ones with view. Right, cancel that. Just do the annoying window stacking thing. Three CCFA. Okay. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. There we go. Okay, saved 0 records and deleted 2. Again, just hopping back to the dashboard to double check. Let's see if we cleaned up everything properly. Query records, and there are no records in the database, which is exactly what we want. So that just gives you a brief tour of some of the basics. There is a lot more to discover in the plugin. Hope you download it, check out the samples, and happy coding. All right, thanks.